The screams stopped at dawn. In their place came a silence so profound that Sarah Whitman knew, without looking, that she'd lost another mother. But this time, the baby lived. And this time, the father standing in her doorway wasn't asking for his child back. He was begging her to keep him. Because sometimes the most sacred promises aren't made with words, but with milk, with warmth, with a mother's heart that doesn't recognize the color of a child's skin, or the enemy lines drawn by men who've never held a dying infant in their arms. And sometimes the greatest love stories aren't between man and woman, but between strangers who become family through the simple act of choosing to care. This is the story of Sarah Whitman, a frontier midwife who had buried her own baby and husband in the same bitter winter that taught her the difference between surviving and living. For 3 years, she had moved through the Colorado territory like a ghost, delivering babies into a world that seemed determined to steal them back, healing wounds that mirrored the ones carved into her own soul. And this is the story of Nahuel, a Comanche warrior whose name meant jaguar in his native tongue, but who had been reduced to something far more fragile the night his wife died bringing his son into the world. He had followed his people's tradition, accepted that some losses were too great to bear, and prepared to let his newborn follow his mother to the spirit world. But when he looked into Sarah's eyes, eyes that had seen the same devastation he carried, something inside him chose hope over heritage. What neither of them expected was how quickly a child could become a bridge between two worlds that had spent decades trying to destroy each other. How easily a Comanche warrior could kneel in gratitude before a white woman who asked for nothing but the chance to love something again. How naturally a woman who had given up on her own happiness could find herself fighting for someone else's survival. The morning Sarah Whitman first pressed baby Ayana to her breast, she thought she was simply keeping a promise to save a life. She didn't know she was about to discover that sometimes the children we don't birth are the ones who truly make us mothers. She didn't know that the warrior who watched her with tears streaming down his painted face would become the family she'd stopped believing was possible. Because in 1879, on the unforgiving frontier of Colorado Territory, love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you fought for, bled for, and built with your own hands from the ruins of everything you'd lost before. It was something you found in the most unexpected places, with the most unlikely people, through the most impossible circumstances. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to open your heart to a grieving father and his motherless child, it was something that could heal wounds you thought would never stop bleeding. Something that could teach you that family isn't about blood or birth, but about the sacred promise to love someone enough to let them change you completely. But that dawn, as Sarah held a Comanche baby to her chest and watched his father's shoulders shake with relief, none of that mattered except the simple truth that this child needed her, and she needed to be needed. Everything else, the fear, the prejudice, the voice in her head warning her about the consequences of caring too much, would have to wait. Because sometimes love arrives not as a choice, but as a responsibility. And Sarah Whitman had never walked away from her responsibilities, especially when they came wrapped in blankets and looking at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The pounding on Sarah Whitman's door came at 3 a.m, sharp and desperate in the way that could only mean one thing. Someone was dying, and they needed her to try to stop it. Sarah was already pulling on her boots before the second round of knocks began. 3 years of frontier midwifery had taught her to sleep light, dress fast, and never assume the person at her door would be someone she expected. But when she opened it, the sight that greeted her sent ice through her veins despite the warm September night. A Comanche warrior stood on her porch, his face painted with the traditional stripes of his people. But it was the desperation in his dark eyes that made Sarah's hand pause on the shotgun she kept by the door. Behind him, barely visible in the moonlight, she could see a horse with a makeshift travois attached, and on that travois, a woman's form covered in blankets. "Help," the warrior said in heavily accented English, the single word carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say. "Please." Sarah had delivered babies for Comanche women before, always in secret, always with the understanding that what happened in her cabin stayed in her cabin. The territorial government didn't much care for white women who helped savages, but Sarah had buried too many children to start caring about politics when lives were at stake. Bring her inside, Sarah said, grabbing her medical bag and clearing the table in her main room with practiced efficiency. The warrior, who Sarah would later learn was called Nahuel, carried his wife into the cabin with a gentleness that contradicted everything Sarah had been told about Comanche men. The woman, barely conscious and burning with fever, was young, maybe 19, with long black hair plastered to her face with sweat and exhaustion. "How long has she been in labor?" Sarah asked, already examining the woman's condition with the clinical detachment that had kept her sane through dozens of difficult births. "2 days," Nahuel replied, his voice tight with fear he was trying not to show. "Maybe more." She asked for you. Said white medicine woman might know what our healers do not." Sarah nodded grimly. She'd seen this before. Pregnancies that went on too long, babies positioned wrong, mothers whose bodies simply couldn't do what nature intended. Sometimes there were miracles. More often, there were choices that no one should have to make. "What's her name?" Sarah asked, checking the woman's pulse and finding it rapid and thready. "Itzel means rainbow in our tongue." Nahuel's voice broke slightly on his wife's name. She was the strongest woman in our band, never afraid of anything." "She's still strong," Sarah said firmly, though privately she was calculating odds and finding them wanting. "But the baby's turned wrong, and she's lost a lot of blood. I'm going to need your help." For the next 4 hours, Sarah worked with the desperate precision of someone who knew they were fighting death itself. Noelle proved to be an able assistant, following her instructions without question, holding his wife's hand and whispering Comanche prayers that sounded like music even in their urgency. Itzel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in pain, sometimes gripping Sarah's hand with surprising strength and speaking in rapid Comanche that Noelle translated with increasing desperation. "She says the baby is strong," he told Sarah during one of these exchanges. "Says she can feel him fighting to live. She makes me promise to save him if she cannot save herself." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. She'd heard variations of this plea before, from women who somehow knew their time was running out. It was the hardest part of her job, the moment when hope shifted from saving 2 lives to choosing one. "Tell her we're going to save them both," Sarah said, though she could see in Nahuel's eyes that he didn't believe it any more than she did. The baby came at dawn, just as Sarah had exhausted every technique she knew, and was beginning to prepare for the kind of intervention that might save the child, but would almost certainly kill the mother. One moment Itzel was screaming in pain, the next she was pushing with the last of her strength, and suddenly Sarah's hands were full of slippery, wriggling life. The baby was small but perfectly formed, with his mother's delicate features and his father's strong hands. He came into the world silent, blue-tinged and still, and for a terrible moment, Sarah thought she'd lost them both. But then she was moving on instinct, clearing the baby's airway, rubbing his tiny chest, breathing life into lungs that didn't want to work, and suddenly, blessedly, came the sound she'd been praying for, a thin, reedy cry that filled the cabin like music. "A son," Sarah said, wrapping the baby in clean blankets and turning to share the joy of new life with his parents. That's when she saw that Itzel wasn't moving. The young woman lay still as stone, her face peaceful but empty, in the way that meant her spirit had already begun its journey to whatever came next. The effort of bringing her son into the world had taken the last of her strength, and there had been nothing left to keep her tethered to this life. Nahuel made a sound like a wounded animal when he realized what had happened. He reached for his wife's face with shaking hands, saying her name over and over like a prayer that might bring her back if he just said it enough times. Sarah stood frozen, holding the crying baby, watching a warrior crumble before her eyes. She'd been present for this moment before, the terrible arithmetic of frontier medicine, where joy and grief existed in the same breath. But she'd never seen a man's heart break so completely, so openly. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. "I tried everything. She gave everything she had to save him." Nahuel looked up at her then, his face streaked with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "She kept her promise," he said quietly. "She saved him." Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms, so small, so vulnerable, so completely dependent on the adults around him to keep him alive. The child was beautiful, with tufts of dark hair, and skin the color of rich earth. But she could see even now that he was going to need careful attention to survive his difficult entry into the world. "He'll need to eat soon," Sarah said gently. Is there someone in your band who can?" Nahuel shook his head slowly. "No nursing mothers. Not for many moons." He stood up, his movements careful and deliberate, and looked down at his dead wife with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "It is our way," he said quietly. "When the mother goes to the spirit world, sometimes the child follows. It is considered a mercy." Sarah's arms tightened around the baby instinctively. "What do you mean?" "He cannot live without milk, without a mother to care for him. And Nahuel's voice broke again. "I cannot look at him without seeing her, without remembering what I have lost. You're talking about letting him die. I am talking about accepting what the spirits have decided." Nahuel's voice was steady now, but Sarah could see the war being fought behind his eyes. "He came into this world to be with his mother. Perhaps that is where he belongs." Sarah looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying, and was now looking up at her with dark eyes that seemed impossibly alert for someone so new to the world. She thought about her own son, buried in the little cemetery behind the church 3 years ago, and about all the children she'd delivered who hadn't lived to see their first birthday. "No," she said quietly. "What?" "I said no." Sarah looked up at Nahuel, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I won't let you give up on him. I won't let another baby die when there's something I can do to prevent it." Nahuel stared at her, confusion and grief warring in his expression. "You do not understand. He is not your blood, not your people. Why would you?" "Because he's alive," Sarah interrupted. "Because his mother died trying to save him, and that has to mean something. Because ... She paused, looking down at the baby again, seeing her own son's face in his features. "Because I've lost too many children to give up on one who still has a chance." The silence that followed was broken only by the baby's soft breathing and the sound of wind through the pines outside. Finally, Nahuel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to offer would change everything for all of them. "I'm saying he doesn't have to die. I'm saying I can feed him. I can care for him. If you'll let me." Nahuel's eyes widened as he understood what she was proposing. "You would do this? For a child who is not yours?" "I would do this for a child who needs a mother," Sarah replied. "The question is whether you can trust someone like me to love someone like him." For a long moment, Nahuel said nothing. Then slowly he reached out and touched the baby's face with one gentle finger. The child turned toward the touch instinctively, and something in Nahuel's expression cracked open. "His name is Ayana," he said quietly. "It means eternal blossom in our tongue." Sarah smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Hello, Ayana," she whispered to the baby. "Welcome to the world." And outside, the sun rose on a day that would be remembered, not for the life that was lost, but for the family that was born from the ashes of grief and the courage to choose love over tradition. The first 3 days nearly broke them both. Noel sat outside Sarah's cabin like a sentinel carved from stone, his back against the pine tree where he'd tied his horse, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but seeing nothing. He wouldn't come inside, wouldn't eat the food Sarah brought him, wouldn't even acknowledge the sound of his son crying from within the cabin walls. Inside, Sarah was discovering that caring for a newborn while grieving his mother was harder than any birth she'd ever attended. Baby Ayana was a fighter. He latched onto her breast with surprising strength for something so small, but he seemed to sense the weight of loss that surrounded his arrival into the world. He slept fitfully, waking every hour to cry with a sound that cut through Sarah's heart like a knife. On the second day, Sarah found Nahuel standing over Itzel's body, which he'd prepared according to Comanche tradition, and laid out in the small lean-to behind Sarah's cabin. He was singing softly in his native tongue, a melody so haunting and beautiful that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, even though she couldn't understand the words. "What are you singing?" she asked quietly, not wanting to intrude but unable to stay away. "Her death song," Noel replied without turning around. "In our way, the soul needs music to find its path to the spirit world. I sing her favorite lullaby, the one she sang to our son while he was still inside her. Sarah noticed the way his voice broke on our son, as if even acknowledging the baby's existence was almost too much to bear. He's sleeping now, she offered gently, finally resting peacefully. He seems to know when you're near. His breathing gets calmer. Noel's shoulders tensed. It would be better if he did not know me. Better for him if he forgets I exist. Why? Sarah moved closer, her voice careful but insistent. Why would it be better for a son not to know his father? Because every time I look at him, I see her. Every time I hear him cry, I hear her voice calling for help that I could not give. Noel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Because I promised her I would keep them both safe, and I failed. Sarah had heard this before, the crushing guilt that came with surviving when someone you loved didn't. She'd felt it herself when her own husband and child died, that terrible arithmetic of grief that whispered, you should have done more, been stronger, found a way to save them. You didn't fail, she said firmly. You brought her to someone who could help. You held her hand through the worst of it. You gave her the strength she needed to save your son. I should have known earlier that something was wrong. Should have brought her to you sooner. Should have what? Been able to see the future? Change the way her body was made? Sarah stepped around to face him, forcing him to meet her eyes. Noel, I've been delivering babies for 8 years. I've seen every complication, every tragedy, every miracle. And I'm telling you right now, there was nothing you could have done differently, nothing anyone could have done. Nahuel looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the depth of his pain written in every line of his face. But she also saw something else, a flicker of desperate hope, quickly suppressed. My people believe that when a mother dies in childbirth, it is because the spirits are calling her home to prepare a place for her child, that the baby should follow quickly so they are not separated. His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. It is considered a mercy, a gift. To let the child linger in this world without his mother, it is seen as cruelty. Sarah felt her own conviction waver for a moment. Who was she to argue with traditions that had sustained a people for generations? Who was she to think her own grief and need gave her the right to interfere with their beliefs? But then, from inside the cabin, came the sound of Ayana's cry. Not the lusty wail of hunger or discomfort, but the thin, desperate sound of a baby who needed comfort. And Sarah knew that whatever tradition said, whatever beliefs dictated, she couldn't let this child die. Not when she had the power to keep him alive. What do you believe? She asked quietly. Not your people, not your traditions. You. What do you believe is right for your son? Nahuel was silent for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I believe she died so that he could live. I believe every moment of pain she endured, every drop of blood she lost, was so that he could take his first breath. He paused, his jaw working as he fought for control. But I also believe that I am not strong enough to raise him without her, that he deserves better than a father who sees only loss when he looks at his child's face. Then don't look at his face, Sarah said simply. Look at his future. What future? He is Comanche in a world that wants to destroy us. He is half-orphan among a people who value strength above all else. What future can I offer him? Sarah thought about her own son, about the dreams she'd had for him before sickness stole him away, about all the futures that existed only in a mother's heart, built from hope and determination rather than certainty. The future you create for him, she said. The future where he grows up knowing he was loved enough that his father chose life over tradition. Where he learns that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it. Nahuel turned away from Itzel's body then, his eyes moving toward the cabin where his son lay sleeping. And if I am not a good father, if I cannot love him the way she would have, then you learn, Sarah replied. The same way every parent learns, by making mistakes and trying again. By choosing him every day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. That evening, as Sarah sat by the fire nursing Ayana and trying not to think about how natural it felt to hold him, Nahuel appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, just watching, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. "May I?" he began, then stopped, his voice catching. "Of course," Sarah said softly, understanding without needing him to finish the question. Nahuel moved slowly into the cabin, as if approaching something sacred and fragile. When he reached Sarah's chair, he knelt down beside it, his eyes fixed on his son's face with an expression of wonder and terror. "He looks like her," he whispered, reaching out with one trembling finger to touch Ayana's cheek, around the eyes. "He has your hands," Sarah observed quietly. "Strong, made for holding on to things." Ayana stirred at his father's touch, turning his head slightly toward the familiar scent and warmth. For a moment his dark eyes opened and seemed to focus on Nahuel's face with the kind of recognition that defied explanation. "Hello, little warrior," Nahuel murmured in Comanche, his voice thick with tears he was no longer trying to hide. "I am your father. I do not know how to do this without your mother, but I will try. I promise you, I will try." Sarah felt her own tears starting as she watched this broken man reach for his son with hands that shook with love and fear in equal measure. It was the first time since Itzel's death that Nahuel had touched the baby willingly, the first time he'd spoken to him as a father rather than a stranger. "I have been thinking," Nahuel said, not taking his eyes off Ayana, "about what you said, about looking at his future instead of my loss. And I think perhaps the spirits did not call Itzel home to take him with her. Perhaps they called her home because they knew he would need someone like you. Someone strong enough to love a child who is not her blood. Someone brave enough to stand between him and death when his own father was too weak to do it." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Nahuel, I cannot take him away from you now," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not when you have already begun to love him. Not when he has found safety in your arms. But I would like to stay. To learn from you how to be the father he needs. If you will have us both." Sarah looked down at Ayana, who had fallen asleep against her chest, his tiny fist curled around a strand of her hair. She thought about the empty cabin that had been her prison for 3 years, about the silence that had driven her nearly mad with loneliness. She thought about the family she'd lost and the family she'd never dared to hope for again. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy and relief and the overwhelming weight of sudden love. "Yes, I'll have you both. We'll figure it out together." Outside, night settled over the Colorado territory with unusual gentleness, as if the land itself was holding its breath to let a new kind of family take root. And inside Sarah Whitman's cabin, a Comanche warrior held his son for the first time, while a frontier midwife discovered that sometimes the children who heal your heart are the ones you choose to love, not the ones you're born to claim. Life, Sarah discovered, had a way of creating its own rhythms when you weren't paying attention. It started with the small things. Nahuel building a lean-to beside her cabin for his own sleeping space, because as he explained with careful formality, it wouldn't be proper for them to share the same roof as unmarried people. Sarah teaching him how to heat milk to the right temperature for when Ayana needed supplemental feeding. The way they began to move around each other in the small cabin like dancers who'd been practicing the same routine for years instead of days. 2 weeks after that first night when Nahuel had held his son, they had settled into something that might have looked like family to an outside observer. But Sarah knew it was more complicated than that, more fragile. They were 3 people learning to love each other while grieving what they'd lost, and some days that felt like trying to build a house in the middle of an earthquake. "He sleeps better when you sing to him," Sarah observed one morning, watching Nahuel cradle Ayana while humming a Comanche lullaby under his breath. Nahuel looked up, startled, as if he hadn't realized he was making any sound at all. Itzel used to sing this one. When he was still inside her, she would put her hands on her belly and sing, and he would stop kicking so hard. "Maybe he remembers," Sarah said gently. "Maybe your voice reminds him of being safe." It was these moments, when Nahuel forgot to guard his heart, when his love for his son broke through the careful walls he'd built around his grief, that Sarah treasured most. But they were balanced by darker times, when she would find him standing over Ayana's cradle with an expression of such profound loss that she feared he might disappear into the wilderness and never come back. The arrangement they'd created wasn't what anyone would call conventional. Sarah handled most of Ayana's daily care. The feeding, the changing, the countless small ministrations that kept a newborn alive and thriving. Noelle contributed in other ways, hunting to keep them fed, repairing the cabin's roof before winter arrived, standing guard during the night hours when Sarah's exhaustion made her vulnerable. But it was in the quiet moments between crisis and routine that something unexpected began to grow between them. Like the evening when Ayana had been fussy for hours, crying despite being fed and changed and rocked and sung to, until both Sarah and Nahuel were at their wits' end. "I'm doing something wrong," Sarah said, tears of frustration making her voice thick. "He won't stop crying, and I don't know what he needs." Nahuel took the baby from her arms without a word and began to pace the cabin, holding Ayana against his chest and speaking to him in rapid Comanche. To Sarah's amazement, the crying gradually subsided until the baby was looking up at his father with wide, alert eyes. "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked, sinking into her chair with relief. "I told him a story," Nahuel replied, sitting down across from her with Ayana still cradled against his chest. "About his mother, about how she was the fastest runner in our band, how she could shoot an arrow through a moving rabbit at 50 paces, how she laughed so loud during the harvest festival that the horses would turn their heads to listen." Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Tell me more about her." And so began the ritual that would define their evenings for weeks to come. After Ayana was fed and settled, Nahuel would tell stories about Itzel, not the sanitized memories of the grieving, but real stories full of laughter and arguments and the thousand small moments that made up a life shared. Sarah found herself looking forward to these sessions almost as much as she looked forward to holding Ayana. There was something deeply intimate about the way Nahuel spoke of his dead wife, something that made Sarah feel trusted in a way she hadn't experienced since her own husband died. "She would have liked you," Nahuel said one night after finishing a story about Itzel's attempts to train a wild Mustang that had wandered into their camp. "She always said the best people were the ones who helped without being asked, who saw need and moved to fill it." "I wish I could have known her," Sarah replied honestly. "From your stories, she sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was, but she is gone, and we are here." Noelle looked down at Ayana, who was sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. "And somehow this feels right. Like maybe the spirits knew what they were doing when they brought us together." It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging what was happening between them. Not romance exactly, but something deeper and more complex. A partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect, seasoned with the kind of trust that only came from weathering crisis together. The challenges they faced weren't just emotional. Living together required constant negotiation of customs and expectations that neither had thought to discuss beforehand. The first time Nahuel returned from hunting with fresh deer meat and began to prepare it according to Comanche tradition, Sarah watched in fascination as he offered portions to the 4 directions and spoke words of gratitude to the animal spirit. "In my people's way," he explained, noticing her attention, "we must honor what gives its life to sustain ours. The deer died so that Ayana could grow strong. It deserves our respect." Sarah nodded, thinking of her own simple prayers before meals, and realized how much more complex Nahuel's world was than she'd understood. "Will you teach me the proper way to do this?" The surprise that flickered across his face told her that he hadn't expected such a request. "You would want to learn our customs? If we're going to raise Ayana together, shouldn't he know about both parts of his heritage?" Sarah paused, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you think it would be inappropriate for me to—" "No," Noelle said quickly. It would be an honor to teach you. Itzel always said that wisdom belonged to everyone who was willing to receive it. And so Sarah found herself learning to read weather signs in cloud formations, to identify edible plants that could supplement their diet, to understand the intricate web of relationships that governed Comanche society. In return, she taught Nahuel to read English, to understand the basics of frontier medicine, to navigate the unspoken rules that governed interactions with white settlers. It was during one of these teaching sessions that they had their first real argument. "You cannot take him to town," Nahuel said flatly, when Sarah mentioned needing supplies from the general store. "It is not safe." "I've been going to Bentley's Crossing for 3 years," Sarah replied, bristling at his tone. "No one's ever bothered me." "You were not traveling with a Comanche baby then. People see him, they ask questions. Questions lead to trouble." Sarah knew he was right, but the implication stung. "So what are you suggesting? That we hide him? That we pretend he doesn't exist?" "I am suggesting that we protect him, that we do not give ignorant people reasons to hurt him." "And what happens when he gets older? When he wants to play with other children, go to school, be part of the world? Do we keep him locked away forever?" Nawal's jaw tightened. "The world you speak of does not want children like him. Better he learns that now than has his heart broken later." "That's not true." But even as Sarah said it, she knew there was bitter truth in Nawal's words. The Colorado Territory wasn't known for its tolerance of mixed-race children, and a baby being raised by a white woman and his Comanche father would definitely draw unwanted attention. "You think because you love him, others will too," Nawal said more gently. "But love is not enough to change men's hearts. Sometimes it is not even enough to keep children safe." Sarah looked down at Ayanna, who was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, oblivious to the complicated world he'd been born into. She thought about her own son, who would have been old enough for school now if he'd lived, old enough to face the casual cruelties that children inflicted on anyone who was different. "Then we'll have to be enough," she said finally. "We'll have to love him enough to make up for everyone who won't. We'll have to be his whole world until he's strong enough to face the bigger one." Nahuel studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing her words against his own fears. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "we will be enough. But Sarah, we must also be careful. For his sake, we must be very careful." That night, as Sarah lay in her bed, listening to Nahuel's quiet breathing from his lean-to and Ayanna's soft sighs from his cradle, she realized that they had crossed another invisible line. They were no longer two people helping each other through a crisis. They were parents, partners in the complex business of raising a child who would never quite fit into the world around him. It was a responsibility that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. But as she drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking not about the challenges ahead, but about the quiet moments of joy they'd already discovered. Ayanna's first smile, Nahuel's surprised laughter when the baby grabbed his finger, the peaceful silence of evening when they were all together and safe. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe love and vigilance and the fierce determination to protect what mattered could build something beautiful, even in a world that didn't understand what they were trying to create. Outside, the Colorado wind whispered through the pines like a lullaby. And inside their unlikely home, three people who had found each other in tragedy slept the deep sleep of those who finally belonged somewhere. October came to the Colorado Territory with the first taste of winter on its breath, and with it, a deepening of bonds that none of them had expected. It started with the small intimacies of shared exhaustion. Ayanna was going through a growth spurt that had him waking every 2 hours, demanding to be fed with the imperious hunger of someone who was suddenly aware that the world contained interesting things worth staying awake for. Sarah found herself stumbling through her days in a haze of sleeplessness that made even simple tasks feel monumental. That's when Nahuel began taking the night watches. "You cannot continue this way," he said one evening after Sarah had nearly fallen asleep while feeding Ayanna. "You are exhausted." "I'm fine," Sarah protested, though she could hear the weakness in her own voice. "It's just a phase. All babies go through it." "Perhaps, but all babies do not have two parents to share the burden." Nahuel reached for Ayanna, who had finished nursing and was now making the soft, contented sounds that meant he was ready to be entertained rather than put back to sleep. "I will take him tonight. Walk with him, sing to him, let you rest." Sarah wanted to argue. It was her responsibility, her promise to care for this child. But the exhaustion was bone deep, and Nahuel's offer felt like salvation. "Wake me if he gets hungry again," she said, settling into her bed with a relief so profound it made her eyes water. "I will," Nahuel promised. "Sleep, Sarah. I will watch over you both." That night, Sarah slept more deeply than she had in weeks. When she woke at dawn, it was to the sound of Nahuel's voice singing softly in Comanche, and Ayana's gurgling responses that sounded almost like laughter. She found them outside where Nahuel had built up the fire and was showing Ayana the way morning light caught in the spiderweb strung between the pine branches. "See, little warrior," Nahuel was saying in English, holding the baby so he could see the delicate silver threads. "The spider works all night to build her home, and in the morning, the sun makes it beautiful. Like your mother's work, invisible until the light touches it." Sarah's heart contracted with something that felt too big for her chest. This was the moment she would remember later as the one when everything changed. Not the crisis moments or the dramatic declarations, but this quiet scene of a father teaching his son to notice beauty in everyday things. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to break the spell. Nahuel looked up with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Good morning. Did you sleep?" "Like the dead." Sarah moved to join them by the fire, accepting the cup of coffee Nahuel poured for her from the pot he'd kept warm. "How was he?" "Perfect. We talked about many things. The stars, the wind, the proper way to greet the sunrise. He is a very good listener." Sarah looked down at Ayana, who was indeed watching his father with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was absorbing every word, every gesture, every lesson in what it meant to be loved. "What did you tell him about the sunrise?" "That every day is a gift," Nahuel replied, his voice growing more serious. "That each morning we wake up is another chance to choose who we want to be. That his mother chose to give him this gift by letting him live, and now it is our job to help him make the most of it." It was these conversations, half philosophy, half practical parenting, that had become the foundation of their unusual partnership. Sarah found herself looking forward to them almost as much as she looked forward to holding Ayana. These moments when she and Nahuel explored not just how to raise a child, but how to become the kind of people worth raising him. The shift in their relationship was subtle but unmistakable. Where before they had moved around each other with careful politeness, now there were casual touches. Nahuel's hand on her shoulder when he reached for something above her head. Sarah's fingers brushing his when they both reached for Ayana at the same time. These moments of contact felt charged with something neither was quite ready to name. It was during one of Ayana's afternoon naps that the subject finally surfaced. "Sarah," Nahuel said, looking up from the arrow he was fletching. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Your husband, what was he like?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In the weeks they'd been living together, Nahuel had told her countless stories about Itzel, but she'd shared almost nothing about her own past. "Thomas was gentle," she said finally. "He was a school teacher before we came west. He loved books, loved learning new things. He used to read to me in the evenings. Poetry, mostly. Sometimes stories about places we'd never been but dreamed of visiting. You loved him very much." "I did, but it was a different kind of love than what you had with Itzel, I think." Sarah paused, trying to find words for something she'd never articulated before. "Thomas and we chose each other because we were compatible, because we wanted the same kind of quiet life. It was comfortable, predictable, safe. And now I'm living with a Comanche warrior and raising his son, and nothing about my life is predictable anymore." Sarah looked over at him, surprised by her own honesty. "But I'm not sure I want it to be." Nahuel set down his arrow and gave her his full attention. "What do you want, Sarah?" It was a simple question that felt anything but simple to answer. What did she want? For 3 years, she'd lived with the assumption that wanting things was dangerous, that hope was just another word for eventual disappointment. "I want this," she said quietly, gesturing to encompass the cabin, the sleeping baby, the man sitting across from her. "I want morning conversations and shared responsibilities, and someone who understands that love isn't just a feeling, it's work. Daily work that you choose to do even when it's hard. Even when it's complicated? Especially when it's complicated." Nahuel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as if he was trying to read something written there, in a language he wasn't sure he understood. "Itzel used to say that the best partnerships were like hunting together," he said finally. "Not because you needed the other person to succeed, but because having them there made success more meaningful, made the work itself into something worth doing. Is that what we're doing? Hunting together? I think, Nowell said carefully, we are building something together, something that did not exist before we met, something that belongs to all three of us. That evening, after Ayana had been fed and settled, they found themselves sitting closer together than usual by the fire. Not touching, but close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from Nahul's body, close enough to see the way the firelight played across his features. Nahul, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens when spring comes, when travel becomes easier and your people expect you to return to them? It was the question that had been haunting her for weeks, the knowledge that this arrangement they'd built was temporary, that eventually the outside world would intrude and force them to make choices they weren't ready to make. I have been thinking about that, Nahuel replied. My band will move north with the buffalo herds come spring. It is our way. We follow the game, follow the seasons. But Ayana, he paused, his jaw tightening with emotion. Ayana needs stability, needs to know where home is, needs to grow up feeling safe. And you? What do you need? Nahuel turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. I need to know that when I wake up in the morning, the two people who matter most to me in this world are close enough to touch, he said quietly. I need to know that I am not facing whatever comes next alone. I need... He stopped, shaking his head. I need more than I thought I had the right to ask for. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. What if you asked anyway? Sarah? What if you asked and I said yes? What if I told you that I've been thinking about spring too, about what happens when the snow melts and the world opens up again? What if I said that I don't want to face it alone either? The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then Nahuel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. Then I would say that three people who started as strangers have become something like family, he said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm, and that maybe the spirits knew what they were doing when they brought us together. Even though we come from different worlds, especially because we come from different worlds, Ayana needs to see that love is bigger than the boundaries people draw. That family is something you build, not something you're born into. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his dark and calloused from years of hunting and fighting, hers pale and marked with the small scars of a frontier midwife's work. They looked right together, she thought, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their proper place. So what are we saying? She asked softly. What are we choosing? We are saying that love is worth fighting for, Nahuel replied. We are choosing each other, choosing this family we've made, choosing to believe that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. Even if it's difficult, even if people don't understand, especially then, as if summoned by their conversation, Ayana stirred in his cradle, making the soft sounds that meant he was waking up and would soon want attention. But for the first time in weeks, Sarah didn't immediately move to tend to him. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hand in Nahuel's, watching the future rearrange itself around this moment of quiet choosing. We should probably put this conversation on hold, she said reluctantly as Ayana's sounds grew more insistent. Yes, Nahuel agreed, but neither of them moved. But Sarah? Yes? This conversation is not finished. When spring comes, when we have to decide what kind of family we want to be, we will finish it then. Promise? Promise. And as Sarah finally rose to tend to Ayana, she carried with her the warmth of Nahuel's hand and the knowledge that for the first time in 3 years, she was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The horses appeared on the ridge at dawn, their silhouettes black against the pale November sky, like harbingers of a reckoning Sarah had hoped would never come. Nahuel saw them first. He was outside chopping firewood for the day, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own heartbeat, when his axe stopped mid-swing and his entire body went rigid with recognition. Sarah, he called, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone that made her blood run cold. Bring Ayana inside now. Sarah didn't question him. She scooped the baby from his blanket where he'd been enjoying the morning sun and carried him quickly into the cabin, her heart hammering as she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats growing closer. Through the window, she counted them as they descended toward the cabin. 15 riders, all Comanche, all painted for what looked like either ceremony or war. At their head rode a man she didn't recognize, older than Nahuel, with silver threading through his long black hair, and a presence that spoke of authority earned through years of difficult decisions. "Who are they?" Sarah asked as Nahuel entered the cabin, his face grave. "My brother Running Wolf and the council elders," Nahuel replied, checking his rifle before setting it aside, in a gesture that spoke of both caution and respect. "They have come for Ayana." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She instinctively clutched the baby closer to her chest, feeling Ayana's warm weight as both comfort and devastating reminder of what she stood to lose. "What do you mean they've come for him?" "The band has been traveling since the first snow. Winter camps are being established near Bent's Fort, and—" Noel paused, his jaw working as he struggled with words. "And they expect me to bring my son home." "This is his home," Sarah said fiercely. "This is where he belongs. I know that. You know that. But they—" Nahuel moved to the window, watching as the riders formed a semicircle around the cabin. "They see a Comanche child being raised by a white woman, and they think of all the children who have been stolen from our people, all the families torn apart by those who claim to know what is best for us." Sarah felt the terrible irony of the situation settle around her like a noose. Everything she had done, taking Ayana in, loving him, protecting him, could be seen as just another form of the cultural theft that had devastated Native communities across the territory. "But you're his father," she protested. "Surely they can't force you to—" "They can do whatever the council decides is best for the band," Nahuel said quietly. "And a warrior who chooses a white woman over his own people, that is not something that strengthens the tribe." The knock on the door came then, firm and measured. Nahuel straightened his shoulders, touched Sarah's face once with gentle fingers, and went to answer it. The conversation that followed was entirely in Comanche, but Sarah didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone. Running Wolf's voice carried the weight of authority and disappointment, while Nahuel's responses grew increasingly tense as the discussion continued. Finally, Nahuel stepped back and gestured for the older man to enter. Running Wolf was smaller than his brother, but carried himself with the kind of dignity that made size irrelevant. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail: the baby's cradle, Sarah's medical supplies, the obvious signs of a life shared between two very different worlds. "You are the woman who saved my nephew," Running Wolf said in careful English, his gaze settling on Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. "I am the woman who loves him," Sarah replied, lifting her chin despite the fear racing through her veins. "Love." Running Wolf seemed to taste the word, finding it either bitter or strange. "White people speak much of love while they steal our children, put them in schools that teach them to hate who they are, tell them their families are savage and their ways are wrong. I would never do that," Sarah said, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands. "I want Ayana to know both sides of his heritage, to be proud of his father's people." Words Running Wolf dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Easy to say, harder to live. What happens when he asks why his skin is darker than yours? When white children call him names? When he realizes he will never fully belong in your world?" Sarah thought of all the conversations she and Nahuel had had about this very subject, all the fears they'd shared about raising a mixed-race child in a territory where difference was often met with violence. "Then we'll teach him that belonging isn't about looking like everyone else," she said firmly. "We'll teach him that his worth comes from who he is, not how others see him. We'll teach him to be proud of both his mother's strength and his father's courage." "We?" Running Wolf's eyes flicked to Nahuel, who had remained silent throughout this exchange. "My brother has told you he will choose you over his people?" "Your brother has told me that love is worth fighting for," Sarah replied. "That family is something you build, not something you're born into." Pretty words, but winter is coming, and pretty words do not keep children warm when the snow is deep and the food is scarce. Can you provide for him the way his people can? Can you teach him to hunt, to track, to survive in the world he will actually have to live in? The questions hit their mark because they echoed Sarah's own doubts, fears she tried to suppress but couldn't entirely dismiss. Could she really give Ayanna everything he would need? Was her love enough to compensate for everything else he would lack? "I can teach him to heal," she said quietly. "I can teach him to help people, to save lives, to see beyond the divisions that keep people apart. I can teach him that gentleness is not weakness, that caring for others is the highest form of strength. And when the soldiers come, when the government decides that all Comanche must be moved to reservations, what will your teachings matter then?" Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She'd heard rumors of such policies, whispered conversations in town about the government's plans for the remaining free tribes. The thought of Ayanna being swept up in such upheaval, torn away from everything he'd known. "Then we'll face that when it comes," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to project. "Together." Running Wolf studied her for a long moment, then turned to Noelle and spoke in rapid Comanche. Sarah caught a few words she'd learned. Woman, child, choose. But the context remained frustratingly opaque. Noelle's response was longer, more passionate, his voice rising with what sounded like argument or plea. Running Wolf listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When Noelle finished speaking, silence filled the cabin like smoke. Finally, Running Wolf looked at Sarah again. "My brother says you have taught him to see beyond the boundaries of blood and tribe. He says you have shown him that love can bridge any divide, heal any wound." The older man's voice carried no mockery but no warmth either. "These are beautiful ideas, but ideas do not stop bullets. Ideas do not prevent children from being taken in the night by soldiers who see only savages to be civilized." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked, though she already knew, already felt the future tilting away from everything she'd dared to hope for. "I am saying that winter camps are no place for debates about love and family. I am saying that a Comanche child belongs with Comanche people, learning Comanche ways, prepared for the hard realities of what it means to be our people in this changing world. And if I refuse, if I won't let you take him." Running Wolf's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Then you will be treated as someone who has stolen a Comanche child, and my warriors will take him anyway." Sarah felt her world cracking apart, all the careful hope she'd built over the past months crumbling like a house made of paper. But then Ayanna stirred in her arms, making the soft cooing sounds that meant he was waking up, and she felt something fierce and protective rise up from the deepest part of her soul. "No," she said quietly. "Sarah," Nowell started, but she cut him off. "No," she repeated louder this time. "I won't let you take him. I don't care about your traditions or your fears or your politics. This baby has a mother and a father who love him, a home where he's safe and wanted. You have no right to destroy that." "I have every right," Running Wolf said, his voice hardening. "He is my blood, my people's future. You are nothing to him but the woman who happened to be present when he needed milk." The words were meant to wound, and they found their target, but they also ignited something in Sarah that she hadn't felt since the day her own son died. The absolute refusal to let death and loss have the final word. "Then you don't understand anything about what makes a mother," Sarah said, rising to her feet with Ayanna still in her arms. "You don't understand that love isn't about blood or tradition, or who has the right to claim what. You don't understand that this baby knows my voice, my touch, my heartbeat, that he smiles when he sees me, calms when I hold him, trusts me to keep him safe." She moved closer to Running Wolf, no longer afraid of his authority or his threats. "You want to take him away from that? You want to tear him away from the only parents he's ever known because you think your way is the only right way? Then you're no better than the soldiers you're afraid of." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Running Wolf smiled, not with warmth, but with something that might have been respect. "You have spirit," he said. "I begin to understand why my brother would choose you over easier paths." He turned to Nahuel, spoke a few more words in Comanche, then headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Sarah. 3 days, he said. "You have 3 days to decide what kind of life you want to give this child. Choose wisely, white woman. Choose for his sake, not your own." And then he was gone, leaving Sarah and Nahuel alone with their son and the terrible weight of an impossible decision. The 3 days passed like a held breath, each hour weighted with the knowledge that everything they'd built together hung in the balance of an impossible choice. Sarah barely slept, spending her nights holding Ayana and memorizing every detail of his face, the way his tiny fingers curled around hers, the soft sounds he made while nursing, the trust in his dark eyes when he looked up at her. She tried not to think about what it would feel like to hand him over to strangers, tried not to imagine the emptiness that would follow. Noel paced the cabin like a caged wolf, torn between loyalty to his people and love for the family he'd found in grief. He spoke little during those 3 days, but Sarah could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the weight of generations of tradition battling against the fierce protectiveness he felt for his son. On the morning of the 3rd day, they woke to find that Ayana had developed a fever. It started small, a warmth to his skin that Sarah initially attributed to too many blankets. But by midday, the baby was listless and refusing to nurse, his tiny body burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could diminish. "It's not serious," Sarah told herself as much as Noel, checking Ayana's temperature for the 12th time. "Just a minor illness. Babies get them all the time." But privately, she was terrified. Frontier medicine offered few options for treating infant fevers, and she'd seen too many healthy babies succumb to illnesses that seemed minor until they turned deadly. "What can we do?" Nahuel asked, his voice tight with the same fear that was clawing at Sarah's chest. "Keep him cool. Try to get fluids into him. And pray," Sarah replied, settling into the rocking chair with Ayana pressed against her chest. "Sometimes that's all we can do." They took turns through the day and into the night, one of them always holding the baby, while the other prepared cool baths or heated thin broths that Ayana mostly refused. Sarah found herself bargaining with God, with fate, with whatever forces might be listening. "Let him live, and I'll accept whatever happens. Let him get through this, and I won't fight Running Wolf's decision." But even as she made these desperate promises, she knew she was lying. She would fight for Ayana until her last breath, fever or no fever, consequences be damned. Dawn came gray and cold, bringing with it the sound Sarah had been dreading. Hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Through the window, she could see Running Wolf and 2 other warriors riding toward them with the inexorable certainty of a thunderstorm. "They're here," Nahuel said unnecessarily, his voice hollow. Sarah looked down at Ayana, who lay limp and burning in her arms, his breathing shallow and rapid. The fever had worsened during the night, and she could see the resignation in Nahuel's eyes, the terrible knowledge that their son might not survive long enough for any of this to matter. "I won't let them take him while he's sick," Sarah said fiercely. "I don't care what their traditions say. He needs medical care, not a long journey in the cold." "Sarah!" "No." She stood up, still holding the baby, and moved toward the door. "If Running Wolf wants to take Ayana, he can explain to his own people why he's willing to risk a child's life for the sake of tribal politics." The knock came then, and Nahuel opened the door to reveal Running Wolf standing on the threshold, his face grave but not unkind. "It is time," the older man said simply. "No, it isn't," Sarah replied, stepping forward so he could see Ayana's flushed, fever-bright face. "Look at him. Really look at him. Does this look like a child who should be traveling?" Running Wolf's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his eyes flick to the baby, saw the way his mouth tightened almost imperceptibly when he registered Ayana's condition. "Illness is part of life," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Comanche children are strong. They survive what would kill softer peoples." "Comanche children also deserve every chance to live," Sarah shot back. "They deserve parents who put their welfare above pride and politics." "You dare lecture me about what children deserve?" Running Wolf's voice hardened. "You, who would keep a Comanche boy from his people, his heritage, his true identity?" "I would keep him alive," Sarah said simply. "Everything else is secondary to that." The silence that followed was broken by a new voice, soft, musical, speaking in rapid Comanche from somewhere behind Running Wolf. Sarah looked past him to see an older woman approaching, her long gray hair braided with beads, and her weathered face marked by the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of difficult decisions. "My wife, Singing Bird," Running Wolf said quietly as the woman joined them. "She wishes to see the child." Singing Bird moved past both men without ceremony, her eyes fixed on Ayana with the focused attention of someone who had raised many children and lost some along the way. She reached for the baby, and Sarah found herself handing him over without conscious thought, recognizing something in the older woman's manner that spoke of competence and care. What followed was a gentle but thorough examination. Singing Bird checking Ayana's breathing, feeling his forehead, listening to the way he cried when she touched his stomach. She spoke quietly to herself in Comanche throughout the process, occasionally making soft clicking sounds of concern. Finally, she handed the baby back to Sarah and turned to speak to her husband in a voice too low for Sarah to hear clearly. But she caught enough words, sick, dangerous, wait, to understand the gist of the conversation. Running Wolf listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When Singing Bird finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Sarah, Nahuel, and the baby in her arms. "My wife says the journey would kill him," he said finally. "She says he needs days, maybe weeks, of careful nursing before he would be strong enough to travel." "Then you'll wait?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to hope. "We will make winter camp here, in this valley," Running Wolf replied. "Close enough to watch over him, far enough to respect your arrangement. And in the spring?" Running Wolf looked at his brother, then back at Sarah. "In the spring, we will see what kind of child you have raised. Whether he knows his father's language, his people's ways, whether he is Comanche in his heart, or just in his blood." It wasn't the complete victory Sarah had hoped for, but it was time. Time to prove that love could transcend the boundaries of race and culture. Time to show that a child could belong to two worlds without losing his identity in either. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. As Ayana slowly recovered from his fever, the Comanche camp became a regular part of their daily routine. Singing Bird visited often, bringing herbal remedies and advice that helped speed the baby's healing. Running Wolf's younger warriors, curious about the white woman who had so boldly defied their leader, began stopping by to trade goods or simply to satisfy their curiosity. Most surprisingly, the presence of his people seemed to unlock something in Nahuel that Sarah hadn't even realized was missing. He began speaking Comanche to Ayana more frequently, teaching Sarah words and phrases so that their son would grow up truly bilingual. He showed her how to prepare traditional foods, how to read weather signs the way his people did, how to see the land through Comanche eyes. "You are building bridges," Singing Bird told Sarah one afternoon, as they watched Nahuel demonstrate traditional hunting techniques to some of the younger warriors while Ayana slept peacefully in Sarah's arms. "Not just between white and Comanche, but between old ways and new. This is sacred work." "Is it enough?" Sarah asked. "Will it be enough to keep us together when spring comes?" Singing Bird smiled, her weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "Love is always enough, child. The question is whether people are brave enough to choose it over fear." That evening, as the first green shoots of early spring pushed through the last of the winter snow, Running Wolf made his decision. "The child knows his father's songs," he announced after watching Nahuel sing Ayana to sleep in Comanche. "He responds to our language as readily as yours. He smiles at Comanche faces, shows no fear of different skin or customs." Sarah held her breath, waiting for the rest. "But more than this," Running Wolf continued, "he has something that cannot be taught or inherited. He has parents who would die for him, who have already remade their lives around his needs. This is the greatest gift any child can receive." He looked at Sarah then, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You have proven that love does not recognize the color of skin or the boundaries between peoples. You have shown my brother what it means to choose family over tradition, future over past." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And you have earned the right to call yourself the mother of a Comanche child." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally lifted from her shoulders. "What does this mean?" she asked through her tears. "It means," Nahuel said, reaching for her hand, "that we are family, all of us, in every way that matters. And as the Colorado sun set over their valley, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise, three people who had found each other in grief discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that begin with the simple courage to care for someone who needs you. Ayana gurgled contentedly in his mother's arms, surrounded by the warmth of a father's songs and a community's acceptance. Growing up in a world where love had proven stronger than the artificial boundaries that divide human hearts. The midwife's promise had been kept, but it had become something far greater than anyone had dared to dream. It had become the foundation of a new kind of family, built not on blood or tradition, but on the revolutionary idea that love is always enough. And so beneath the endless Colorado sky, another tale finds its place among the legends of the Wild West. A story that reminds us that the most powerful force on the frontier wasn't gunpowder or gold, but the revolutionary courage to love beyond the boundaries others had drawn. Sarah Whitman's promise to save a life became so much more than anyone expected. Historical records show that she and Nahuel raised Ayana to become one of the territory's first Native American doctors, a man who used both traditional Comanche healing practices and frontier medicine to serve communities across two cultures. Their family became a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, love over prejudice. But their story asks us a question that echoes across generations. What promises are we willing to make when someone needs us most? When the world tells us to turn away, to protect our own interests, to stay within the safe boundaries of what's expected, do we have the courage to choose compassion instead? In our own time, when division seems easier than unity, when fear often speaks louder than love, Sarah and Nahuel's story offers us something precious. Proof that families aren't just born, they're built by people brave enough to see past differences to find common ground. What would you do? If someone placed a child in your arms and walked away, would you choose the safety of tradition or the risk of love? Have you ever had to become family to someone who didn't share your blood, your background, your beliefs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of unexpected families? Your moments of choosing love over fear matter to us and to everyone watching. If this story touched your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that love really can bridge any divide. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell for more incredible tales of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds that make us human. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your promises sacred. This is Wild West Stories, where love always finds a way.